Hey everyone, welcome to the latest episode of the SaaS Sessions podcast. Today we have Thejo Cote on the show with us. Thejo has been a founder since 2009. That's like great 15 years. He's currently the founder and CEO at Airbase. For folks who don't know Airbase, it's a procure-to-pay solution that combines your enterprise-grade power with delightful user experience to simplify purchasing in organizations. So when you say purchasing, think of corporate cards, think of accounts payable, and a whole lot more. So, Tejo, such a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you for having me, Sunil.
Awesome. So, Tejo, I gave a very short intro, and you have been a founder in these 15 years. I think you've worked on three startups where you have had successful exits also in the past. And I gave a very short intro about you. So, again, would love to know for you to introduce yourself to the audience and also tell us a little bit more about your journey in the SaaS ecosystem.
Thank you again for having me. And I was born in India, grew up there. I came to the US in 2009, and I'm an engineer by training. And I started working soon after my undergrad in India. I worked for about 4.5 years before I came to the US to go to grad school, get a master's degree. And so the ambition always was to do something of my own at some point. And so I started my career at an Infosys, which I think everybody who works in India must be familiar with,
Hmm.
large services company. And I found out soon enough that maybe that size of a company and the kind of work that happened there wasn't exactly for me. And a little more than a year after I joined, I ended up leaving and joining a startup because my long-term ambition, as I said, was to do something of my own. And I thought working at a startup would help me learn what a startup is all about and what it
Mm-hmm.
takes to build one that's successful. I got a chance to go be a part of a startup of a successful founder with past exits and all that in India, which was quite rare back then. This was in
Hmm.
2005, 2006 timeframe. And so that was a fantastic experience, right? Where actually one of my side projects ended up becoming a big focus for the business as a whole and things like that. And that was a fantastic ride. And I really got the experience that I wanted. And yeah, eventually, I wanted to broaden my horizons. And back in 2008, 9, the startup ecosystem in India was not very mature yet, right? Obviously, that's
Hmm.
changed quite a bit in the years since. And so I still felt like I had to come to the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area, Silicon Valley, because this is where the action was definitely back then. And
Hmm.
maybe if it was today, I would never have come here and I would have done something in India. But anyway, I did come here in 2009. Getting that master's degree was a good excuse to come here, and I got to broaden my skill set. I studied human computer interaction and just the process of building better products, right? I was very much an engineer, writing code, building things, and the master's degree allowed me to broaden my horizons a little bit. And at the end of that process is when I started my first company. And that's what I've been doing ever since. And so,
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
Awesome, awesome. That's a great journey. And I think the topic of today's discussion, as you mentioned, right, like when you explored getting into the Bay Area, right, the topic of this discussion is also about your journey from India to the US, right, and especially with Airbase, which is currently, which you are also part of. And what were the challenges and successes of building such a business in a new country is something that we'll talk about. But before I get into there, like you started Airbase 7 years back in 2017 and you've had an amazing journey there, raised about over $100 million, have great customers, right? Netlify, Retool, Sentry, and more. Let's start from the start. So when you started back in 2017, did you know your first or primary base or of customers that you wanted to have were that supposed to be from India? Were that supposed to be directly from the US? So how did your initial wave was when you started back in 2017?
Yeah, so the target market was definitely the US. I think for most SaaS businesses, the US is still the largest, most attractive market. And you know, eh, if you look at a lot of the at scale larger SaaS businesses, they tend to have a fairly large kind of revenue base in the US. And so the US remains a very attractive market for most SaaS companies. And for us, even today, for the most part, we sell into the US as the primary market. And not for the most part, actually, we only sell into the US. If you have to be headquartered in the US, we do have good support in the platform for international operations, subsidiaries, multi-currency stuff and all of that, given what we do. But our buyers are still located in the US, and we sell into the US entities and US headquartered companies for the most part. And that hasn't changed, right? 7 years later, and we've been able to continue to grow by having that focus on the US. And that's
Mm-hmm.
how it's always been. For Airbase, of course, we're a very distributed, global team. We have employees in 16 countries, and the majority of our R&D team, engineering product design, is in India. And then we have obviously teams in the US and Canada and the Philippines and many other countries. And so we're very globally distributed that way, but we tend to serve the primary set of customers. They're all in the US.
Nice, nice. And when you started, like, again, catering to the US market, right? So what were some of the initial challenges that you faced with Airbase, particularly when you were just getting started in the US? Getting customers and validation is still that comes next. But for somebody who's just want to get started in the US, right? What are some of the
Yeah,
challenges that you faced?
I guess the challenges are going to be different if you are
Mm,
starting a business when you are still living in India, building a team out of India, building the product out of India, but you're trying to get customers in the US. And it's definitely easier, or was easier in my case, because I already was here and I was
mm,
living here. And yes, I was building the initial team was all, I was building it in India because all the initial folks that joined Airbase were mostly on the engineering product design side of things. But for me, being out here already, I also had the benefit of Airbase being my second venture funded business. And so I already had a network of folks that
mm,
I could lean into. And in my previous company, we went through Y Combinator and I was plugged into that network. I knew lots of founders who were from my batch and subsequent batches who had companies that were at
mm,
scale. Airbase targets mid-market early enterprise companies, and so there were a number of those kinds of companies in my network where I knew the founders. Of course, we sell to initially back in 2017, we used to primarily sell to CFOs, controllers, finance and accounting teams, basically, right?
mm,
And I had the opportunity to get introduced to them through my founder network. And because
mm,
my previous company was a venture funded company, I knew a good set of investors who I shamelessly tapped into and asked for introductions to their portfolio companies and that kind of stuff. Getting that going off the ground, I think, is for me was maybe a little easier than somebody who's just getting started from scratch out of India. But
mm,
in general, the way I would recommend any founder approach it is beg, borrow, steal, right? Like you got to work
right.
your network to get those initial 10, 15, 20 customers. It also depends on the nature of the business you're building. If you're primarily building a small business tool where the ticket
Mm,
sizes are very low and that people pay you $500 a month, a year, $1,000 a year, and things like that, yeah, you can't really afford to have an expensive sales team doing outbound and things like that. And yeah, maybe at some scale you can make that work, but in general, you probably have a PLG driven model. And in that case, it's less important to work your network to get access to those customers. That becomes more relevant when you want to go after larger customers who are paying you tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. And so you really also have to ask yourself, okay, what's my business model, and how does demand generation happen for that model
mm,
as a whole, what's the size of customer I'm going for, and things like that. But in my case, we were going after companies with at least 100 plus employees for the most part. And
mm,
that meant that working the network, getting introductions to the right buyer internally, and those kinds of things was a little more important. But if that's the nature of the business
mm.
that any of your listeners are building, then I would recommend just hustling in every way possible and using your own network. If you don't have a network, if you've raised a little bit of money, use the investors network, do cold on LinkedIn, whatever it takes to get those initial meetings. And that's what I would recommend, right?
No, definitely. Right. Getting those intros obviously helps, right? Tapping onto whatever network you have through your maybe friends or through your alumni network as well. That's also something that you
Yeah.
can explore, or even like investors, obviously, right? Like your early stage investors can definitely help you in that area. But talking about, especially for those people who don't have a network, like through whatever means, you went into IC and you have that people in your batches, maybe people in your subsequent batches, and just again, like you had were running a venture funded company before, so have like good relationship with the investors. But somebody who's just have that's a very small network, right, with very few investors, like very small early stage or something like that, how can they come to when they're coming to the US? Like how can they get some early customers and not only get the customers, but how do you find that early validation for the product as well? Because the main reason for selling in the US is also being in the US first.
Yep.
And while you are there, the main reason that you are there is to obviously be close to your customers, right? That's the number one aspect, right? The more closer you are, the more better you learn about the persona, the faster you iterate on your product, on your GTM, and whole lot of things, right? So how do you get these early customers? What are some of the ways apart from like doing networking? You mentioned like a cold calling and getting warm intros and stuff like that. But not only getting customers, but how do you get that validation from those customers?
Yeah, look, I'll answer this in two parts. So the first part you asked about, hey, when you just land here, you don't know anybody, right?
Mm,
And how do you plug yourself into the network and how do you get access and open some doors and things like
mm,
that? I think my experience is maybe relevant there when I first got to the US. This was in 2009, 10, 11 time frame. So yeah, when I first landed here, I literally didn't know anybody. I had, I think, one friend from back home in India who worked at Intel or something, and that's
mm,
about it. Right? And all I had was hopes and dreams. But what I ended up doing was ultimately just hustling to get access to and meet interesting people, right? And I made a long list of all the companies that I found useful, that I felt that I might be able to contribute something useful to. And I just
mm,
cold emailed a bunch of the founders and said, hey, can we meet? And one example that comes to mind for me that is a very established company now is a company called Twilio, right? And so Twilio was
mm,
just going back in that time frame. It was a 3-4 person team. And I remember writing to their CTO because I had some relevant experience given the work I had done in my previous job in India. And he was nice enough to agree to meet me. And so I went in and met him. And but then I also had an opportunity through the university network that I was a part of. And I went to events over there. And I met folks, I met other founders. I used the professors that were taking the courses. I remember when I first started, this was towards the latter end of my master's when I decided to start my first company. The very
mm.
first investor meeting I got was one that one of my professors made the introduction. He actually drove
Nice.
me to this, and people are helpful. And if your passion comes through, your desire to do something, build something comes through in your interactions with folks, yeah, they generally tend to be helpful. And so I would recommend just making sure that people understand what you're trying to achieve and accomplish and just reaching out to lots of people. And maybe 90% of them will not respond to you, and that's okay. And
Mm,
even if 10% do, that's how you start to build those connections and relationships. And if one door opens, then maybe the second door will open and things like that, right? And so that's how you start the journey of building the process of
mm,
creating network relationships over time. And then coming back to your other question about, hey, how do you get those initial early customers? That again, it depends on whether you have a little bit of an entry point into networks of companies through investors, through your own network or whatever it is. If you
mm,
don't, then you have to hustle and then cold reach out to people. And yeah,
mm,
maybe 95% of them will not respond to you, but maybe some of them will. And even when I was starting Airbase, while I had a fairly decent network and I opened a bunch of doors that way, I also cold email people because that's also a good signal of your ability to see and test your messaging, right? And so,
mm,
am I sharing a value proposition that makes somebody that I don't even know, who doesn't owe me anything, who doesn't have a relationship, does it make them sit up and go, hey, this actually solves a problem of mine and I should take a little bit of my time to learn more about it? That's useful.
mm.
And one thing I always recommend to founders who are just getting going is that you should definitely find the personas in the early days of your company who like participating in the product building process. And because there are
Right.
different personas even among buyers, where some people, I remember one controller telling me in the very early days of Airbase, hey, I only buy from public companies
Mm,
because that's how risk averse he was. Is like, if the company is not already public, then that's too risky for me. I don't bet on startups and companies that are just getting going. I'm like, okay. And so zero chance such people will work with you as a very early stage startup. That's okay. That's their preference. But at the same time, there are a lot of people who enjoy the process of engaging with startups. And these tend
Mm,
to be also the folks that work at other startups, fast growing startups, and they have that mindset and mentality. And that's why they are there in the first place. And try to find those people, reach out to those people. And you can always ask for advice first. Nobody likes to be sold to. And so you can try the approach of saying, look, I'm getting started in this space. And I think there are XYZ problems that we're trying to
mm,
solve. You are an expert in this area. You've done the work and the problems that we solve. You live it every day. I'd really appreciate it if you could give me 15 minutes of your time so that I can share our thesis of what the problem and the solution to that problem is. And would love your input and feedback. And you know what? That kind of an approach will give you the opportunity to connect with people, because a lot of people, it's also human nature, right? And ego. If you tell
right.
somebody, hey, expert, and can you give me some advice? And people will take the time to
Mm,
connect with you and give you their thoughts. And if you genuinely have something, as you then meet them, tell them about the problem, tell them about the solution, then you can always make the ask towards the end of it that, hey, is this something you would consider using?
right.
And that's a good way to go from outreach, connecting with somebody, and then finally,
Mm.
trying to convert them to a customer. And that would be an approach I would recommend.
Yeah, like building that relationship first and then probably making them convert into our customer rather than hey going hey like bombarding like with 100 people with cold emails and cold calls like hey buy our product, right? That's something which
Correct.
doesn't
Yeah.
work in these days. And one more thing, right? What I've experienced with like whenever I talk to somebody like this, as you mentioned, like you reach out to 100 people, 99 will say no, one will say yes. Take the bet and talk to you, give you like 30 minutes of their time for feedback or whatever. Like one more tip I would say that has helped me is I ask the person at the end of the call, hey, which other two people that you would recommend me that I should talk to? And can I use your reference when I reach out to them? Like 100% of the times they will say yes. Hey, you should talk to this person who I know, this talk to this person who I know as well, and use them. And use that, I don't want to use this word, but use that MLM, like multi-level marketing kind of a scheme to start like reaching. Like the one person connected to two people connected to four people, and that's how the tree and that's how the network grows, right?
100%. And look, even when you get customers and usage for your product in the early days,
Mm,
the best source of new customers are existing customers, right?
mm,
And nothing beats an existing customer reaching out to somebody and saying, hey, this is a really good product that is solving my problems. You should check it out, right?
right.
And that has the highest probability of converting into an actual meeting and then new customer. And so, yes, I 100% agree that you should use your existing
Mm,
customers, advisors, like anybody and everybody that may potentially be able to open new doors to you. You should be a little shameless about asking for
yeah.
that help.
Yeah, yeah. And that helps with validation as well, right? Who better to validate than your existing customers? And moving on to that validation part from your customers. So obviously, given into your space particularly, but there's a lot of these specific industries where you have to adapt your product to that specific geography, right? So when you
Mhm.
talk about, let's say, Airbase or companies into a different vertical, Zenefits or something like that, when there is like payroll and account, like employee payroll management and stuff like that, so there's a lot of product customization that goes in when you are particularly selling to the US geo, right? How did you go about adapting to US geography, considering like Airbase is built for the US, but how would your experience be when it comes to taking customers' feedback or customers' voice and putting that to use in shaping the product?
Ultimately, as a founder, you always want to address, or you want your product to address the largest market possible, right? And this is
Mm,
the whole TAM, or total addressable market, right? But the reality also is that you don't want your TAM to be too large in the early
mm,
days, right? Because then you will likely get pulled in too many different directions. And there is a certain amount of kind of merit in having focus on a specific
mm,
vertical, a specific set of customers, on a specific type of problem. It might even look like it's a little niche in the early days, and that's okay, right? As long as you can
mm,
articulate a story of how you go from that niche to broadening your total addressable market over time. Because the risk in the very early days is, if you have a fairly generic product, and we are a pretty good example of that. We do spend management or procure to pay software. And
Mm.
our goal is to consolidate all the spending that happens in a business, all workflows, all payments into a single product on the non-payroll side, right? So we don't touch payroll dollars. We deal with all the non-payroll dollars. And ultimately, that is a very general problem. Every business has to spend money, right? And every
Mm.
business has an AP problem, a request approval kind of process orchestration problem. They have a corporate card problem. They have an expense management problem. So we could literally go sell to any business. But the reality is that as you start diving into the nuances and specifics of particular verticals and challenges, you will realize that in each of those problem areas, there are very specific aspects that are relevant to
Mm.
that vertical and not to others. And so discipline becomes very important, right? And with Airbase, for example, it is only now 6, 7 years into that journey. Yeah, maybe we started about 18, 24 months ago. We've started solving use cases for manufacturing industries and industries that have inventory. And that's a real
Mm.
thing. When you spend money on inventory, and that's a core part of what you spend your non-payroll dollars on, there are a whole set of things that you have to do as from a procure-to-pay process perspective that our software in the early days didn't have support for, and it was by design, right? Because we could
Mm.
still find all the growth that we wanted by not focusing on those specific problem areas. And I think not having that kind of focus, just because you found a customer, you suddenly start building all the things that they are asking for or making them happy, that can really spread a team quite thin, and you're not making
Mm.
anybody very happy, right? Like, how do you find a smaller cohort of very happy customers and then build on that foundation and that base over time, even if you have to stay within a narrow vertical for some time? But as long as you can articulate the journey of how you can expand over time, I think smart investors will get it. And of course, if the goal is to raise money and build a venture funded business, which doesn't have to be the case for every business, but if that's the
Mm.
goal, you may have to articulate how the TAM expands over time. But yeah, I would always recommend keeping it narrow as long as you are finding customers, and as long as you should only be expanding your TAM when you feel like you're hitting the ceiling of growth, right? Hey, I can't
Mm.
continue to grow quickly because I'm running out of customers in my particular niche. But how do you become extremely loved and recognized in a particular niche is always, I think, the first step, and then you expand from there slowly, right?
Running out of potential customers is like in our categories like a good problem to have, I would say,
Yeah,
where
of
you're
course. And that's where judgment comes in, right? So you can't
mm.
pick a category or a niche that is so small that you can barely get to a meaningful scale of revenue. That's also
Mm.
not the right choice. But you also don't want to pick and target a market that is so large that you're going to get pulled in 100 different directions, and you can't really make any customer happy as you're onboarding them. So you want to find the right balance. And yeah, that's judgment at the end of the day.
Nice, nice. Talking about the outcomes, right? Before we go on to the last section, which is lightning round, like one small pit stops on talking about the outcomes, right? I don't know, traveling back to 2017, 2018, early years for you and Airbase, what are some of the metrics and milestones that you are measuring your projects on, right? Whether it's like building in the US, setting up that GTM, right? So obviously, any founder who's currently building in India, the metrics and milestones would be different as opposed to when you're having the same geographic distribution to the US, it's going to be different, right? The amount of dollars you spend in the US versus how much ROI you get, and the amount of dollars you spend in India and how much ROI you get. It's different. So how can somebody adjust to like A, what are some of the milestones or metrics that people can track when they're making that shift to the US? And B, like what are some of the nuances that people generally get wrong when it comes to like getting those metrics and milestones right because they probably not understand or misunderstand the concept of selling in India versus selling in the US.
Yeah, look, ultimately, I think the India market has the advantage of really high quality talent, but it's an economy where the cost of living is lower and all of that. So that's beneficial to businesses, right? And so when you're
Mm.
trying to get going, especially as a founder, the cost with which you can get to product market fit and continue to scale past product market fit, you can do that a lot more
Mm.
efficiently if you have certain functions out of India, or as much talent as you can find out of India, because generally you can pay very competitively, but
Mm.
find equal talent in a more expensive market. like the US, especially expensive areas to live, like the San Francisco Bay Area, New York, and things like that. I just cost the business more. That's just like math, right? And founders who are building teams out of India have that advantage for sure. And that's great. And then they should take advantage of that. But particularly in terms of milestones, I approached, say, in 2017, 18, as I was going through that early process of finding product market fit, because I think, of course, product market fit is not like some destination you get to. It's always a journey, right? Like you can find product market fit, you can lose it can become strong, it can become weak, and there are lots of factors and dynamics that affect kind of your overall product market fit. But in the early days, though, you are trying to build confidence. Everything that you do and every step that you take, you're trying to build confidence that, hey, am I working and getting towards product market fit? That then gives me the confidence that I can invest behind and scale the go to market and kind of scalable customer acquisition phase of it, right? Because you shouldn't be spending a whole bunch of money on sales and marketing unless you have pretty strong signals that you have product market fit. Now, how do you get to that journey? Of course, as you're still in the phase of finding product market fit, you shouldn't be spending a lot of money, right? So you should spend as little money as possible, because the finding of product market fit can be a 6 month journey, it can be a year-long journey, it can be a 3-4 year journey also. And so it may take time to iterate and get to a point where you feel like, okay, I've identified an important problem with the right kind of solution in a large enough market. And I also have an early idea of how I can acquire those customers. All of these things matter. And then so, at least for myself, I set those goals and specific milestones. I defined those in advance. And so that if I hit those milestones, it would give me confidence that I'm making the right kind of taking the right set of steps towards product market fit. And those milestones could be things like understanding of the problem by speaking with a few dozen customers who you think have that problem and understanding that problem better, and then articulating a solution to that problem, and then building the first version of the solution to that problem, getting usage, convincing folks to even start using your product, and then monitoring the usage. They may say yes because they just feel bad for you or whatever it is, right? But if they're not using the product day to day, you're not hit the milestone of actual usage and ensuring that they are finding value from your product, right? And so you should have specific usage related milestones to build confidence that, hey, that problem, my tool is actually solving it because they're using it every single day, or whatever the right cadence is to solve it. And then another milestone might be exchange of value. Like, are they actually paying you? Willingness to pay, right? How much are they paying you? Do you have enough evidence of that? Because figuring that out is super important, because that will impact your go-to-market strategy in a very meaningful way. Because like I said, if you're only able to charge $1,000 a year versus $10,000 a year versus $100,000 a year, the approach you take to acquire a customer who is worth $100,000 a year to you versus $1,000 a year to you is very different. You can afford to do things if somebody pays you $100,000 a year that you simply can't if somebody pays you $1,000 a year. You want to test for each of these things. You want to test for segment focus, right? Which segment is the right segment for you and your customer, and where is there a scalable, large enough addressable market there? Is the product that you're solving largely a small business product? Is it a mid-market product? Is it an enterprise product? And all of these things, I think you really have to figure out with a minimal expenditure, and not really start to put the foot on the gas and start scaling and spending money on sales and marketing unless you have a fairly good idea. And so I think being disciplined about defining each of those milestones that give you confidence that you have product market fit will de-risk, like all the money you might spend in the future to scale and invest in sales and marketing, right?
Nice, nice. Yeah, I think that makes sense. You have to be patient and keep true to it and keep working towards those milestones that you're setting. Obviously, it's going to be very subjective depending on what category belong to, what sort of approach you have. Is it like a sales-led motion, as you mentioned, like a PLG motion, as you mentioned? And obviously, it's not going to look same for, let's say, your peers or anything like that. It's going to be different, but I think people should look for like small wins as well as they are going towards taking a step-by-step approach to that bigger milestone, right? Again, like great session with you, Thejo. Like moving on to the next section, which is lightning round. So I'm just going to ask you like three questions on top of whatever I've asked already, but nothing related about our journey from India to the US, but just to learn more about you, right? So the first one. So what is the one thing that has helped you shorten your learning curve?
Look, I read a lot. That's always been the case. And I feel like learning from the mistakes that other people have made or from the experiences that other people have gone through is a
Hmm.
fantastic way to shortcut your own learning journey. And of course,
Nice.
can't just read about or listen to the experience of just one person and incorporate that directly into your life. It doesn't always work that way. So you triangulate, right? And so
Right.
and I've always also try to be a student of technology history, and I've always tried to consume the kind of stories of lots of the impactful businesses that a lot of us, all of us look up to and respect. And there are always
Hmm.
lessons there. And so you can, by speaking to people, by reading, by watching videos, whatever is the consumption mechanism that best suits you, you can learn a lot by just the journeys and the experiences of other people. Obviously, you have to triangulate that and apply it to your own circumstance. And because not everybody's experience applies directly in your case, right? And so you have to use your judgment on what applies and what doesn't apply. But it's a fantastic way to compress instead of you going through every experience yourself and learning that way. How can
Hmm.
you accelerate that by learning through the experiences of others? I think is a question I've always asked myself, and that's been helpful for me.
Nice, nice. That's really interesting because I do that as well, where I talk to a lot of people on the show, and that's like a huge learning from me and learning from their experiences, right? It's just easy to like quickly learn a lot of stuff at scale, right? Obviously, I'm saying it's easy, but it's definitely difficult for me to run a podcast as well. But yeah, overall, on to the second one, right? So, what do you know about your work now that you wish you would have known when you first started?
Look, when I first started my kind of founder journey with my first company, I things I've done differently. I guess I could reframe that a little bit. What have I done a little differently with Airbase that I didn't know about the first time around? Simple things like hiring in a more distributed way. I think there are advantages. I'm definitely not religious about remote work. I'm a lot more pragmatic and practical about it. But I think for lots of different kinds of roles, going where the talent is around the world, there are smart people everywhere in the world. That's a big advantage, right? So in terms of
Hmm.
hire and scaling of teams, the cost effectiveness of it, and all that. There's lots of advantages there. And so that's a big lesson that I've taken away. And also, another thing that I've tried to do differently with Airbase is that I wasn't as deliberate when I was building my first company about culture, values, shaping that. Not that in my first company, the people we hired were like bad people. They weren't. They were all really good people. But if you're not deliberate about values and culture, people tend to pull it in their own directions, and there isn't a certain cohesiveness and identity to the company as a whole. And that's something I'd like to think we've done better with Airbase in terms of what our values are and who we are as a company, what we care about, and the kind of people that we want to bring into the company from the interview process, how we look for that.
Hmm.
And I think we've done better. And the last thing that is personally important to me, given the stage of my career and all that kind of stuff, is just valuing the quality of the journey and the kind of people you work with. And I
Hmm.
just paid a lot more attention to that, and I have, you know, less patience the older I get to just spend time with or work with people that just don't enjoy spending time with, because building companies can be a long journey, and you want to do
Yeah.
that with people you actually want to spend time with. And so for
Hmm.
me, the journey is as important as the outcome, and so optimizing for that has been another important lesson that I've taken away.
Nice, nice. That's very insightful. And the last one, and since you mentioned you read a lot, this would be like easy or maybe difficult for you to answer because you have to pick one. So, what's that one book that you would recommend to the listeners?
That's a very hard question for me to answer, because there are so many amazing books, and
Yeah.
if you have a habit of reading, you will never get bored. And I've also gone through my phases. And in the early part of my founder journey, I used to read a lot of business books and frameworks and strategy and this and that. And a lot of it was good, some of it is not good. Yeah. So, but in the recent past, for the last few years, for example, I don't read as many, because I think the value started plateauing. The messages were repetitive, and I didn't feel like I was taking as much value given the time I was investing in it. But over the last few years, for example, I've mostly been reading science fiction and that stuff like that, which there was a lot of classic science fiction I'd never read. And I've, for multiple years, I've been going back in time and reading a lot of the classic science fiction, which has been very enjoyable and fantastic, and that's been great. But if you really were to push me to pick one book for founders to read, especially if you're a technical founder like me, I would pick books that allowed you to understand human psychology and the process of selling, and something that
Mm,
uh, if you're an introverted kind of engineer like me who has ambitions of starting a company, that helps, right?
mm,
Because everything about building a company is sales, right? And because if you open your mouth, you're selling as a founder. That might be because you're literally trying to sell to a customer that you want them to pay you, or it might be an investor. You're selling to them because you want them to give you money, or you're selling to a potential kind of team member because you want them to come and join you. Like, it doesn't matter, right? And
mm,
if you're in that phase of the journey, for actually forever as a founder, you're selling, right? And so understanding human psychology, what makes people, do the thing that you might want them to do, and how you might be able to influence their thinking. Of course, all in positive ways, because you believe that's the right outcome for them too. I think those things matter. And a book that I think is a classic and will always remain a classic is Robert Cialdini's Influence, right? And
mm.
he has a kind of a framework of things that uh, really, it's like the psychology of persuasion, I think, is the tagline of that book. And I have found that it is one of the few books, business books and psychology books and things like that, that have stood the test of time for me in terms of the relevance of the frameworks and the lessons that I read in that book. So I would probably recommend that as a good book for someone to pick up, especially if you're going to be in the journey of
Mm.
influence and persuasion, which is a huge thing when you're trying to build a business, right?
Totally, no, always be closing, right? Like ABCs of business, right? Whether you're closing customers for you, whether closing investors to invest in you, whether you're closing your employees to or future employees to join you, it's
Yep.
like you're right, you're selling all the time. But yeah, again, it's been a pleasure, Tejo. Thanks a lot for coming and taking time and sharing all these amazing insights with us. I feel like definitely I learned a thing about to on like how to get that early customers and validation, right? Like this seems easy, but it's an easy miss for a lot of people, like generally. So a lot of interesting insights here. Again, thanks a lot for taking time and sharing those here.
Thank you for having me.